Hi listener, this is From Ideology to Unity, a spiritual journey where we let go of ego and ideological doctrine in favor of meaning, purpose, and unity as a whole. So I'm doing another reading today on Decoding Schopenhauer's Metaphysics by Bernardo Kastrup. And so what have we covered so far in this book? Just to refresh people's memory. So first of all, we started talking about the will and representation and these basic metaphysical concepts of Schopenhauer, according to this author, where will is essentially will being kind of, the way I interpreted it anyway, reading this, is that will is like source and the I am presence within us that is the observer, and representation is like the ego. But on a universal level, that would be pretty much like, I guess, like everything that's source and soul and spirit is like truly real, and the rest is the hologram or the simulation in a sense, but it's a spiritual simulation. Now, I interpret his metaphysics as basically a sort of simulation theory, essentially, but counts in different terms. And so the will is like the source, the representation is what's represented by the will, but is ultimately derived from the will. Now, obviously, there's a lot more to it than this, but what we got to is this idea that there's more to consciousness than simply the materialist idea of thought, or that you can measure in the brain or something, or like the idea that it's and there's much more to it than simply attention, where your attention is and what the brain activity is. So there's a diagram, for example, explaining it, where first of all there's external stimuli coming in, and there's immediate experience of feelings. And so then there's this arrow, right? And it goes, which is perceptual feelings from immediate experience of feelings to the intellect is an arrow, or which is perceptual feelings. But there's another one, which is endogenous feelings, which is partly entering space-time. So, okay, that's already getting a bit heavy and confusing if you haven't heard the episodes already. But basically, the second stage, the intellect, projects onto, there's basically a scaffolding of, which is in our minds, which is sort of a representation of things. And that's intellectually represented inside our minds. And it involves a cause and effect relationships. And this is the first step of re-representation. So there's the original experience of feelings. We represent it as we conceptualize what we're experiencing, pretty much. But while we perceive it on a conscious level, there's also endogenous feelings, which actually involve space-time. Now, what is exactly that's talking about? On the top of my head, I'm not sure, but basically there's an aspect to it that transcends space and time anyway. Or at least that can't be reduced to merely the thoughts and the conceptualizations about it. It's not just the perceptions about it. But then from the intellect, there's another arrow, which is to perceptual representations, and also a dotted line, like endogenous feelings was a dotted line, saying knowledge of feelings, but with unclear subject or object distinction. An unclear subject-object distinction would be effectively non-dualistic, which is actually more accurate in a sense. So the dotted line is more what the I am presence is doing, perhaps, and whatever, I'll show you again if you're watching the video. You might have seen it in previous episodes if you watched it. Here's the diagram. Wait. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure exactly how to summarize everything here, but basically, then there's further re-representation, and it's kind of, on an abstract level, you repeat the abstractions And this can be problematic potentially especially if it's dishonesty with yourself, or it's kind of, because then you're kind of getting further away from the actual experience and you're interpreting everything via a filter and your conditioning. And that can be a problem. But the dotted line that feeds back into itself is conceptual knowledge of feelings, knowledge of the will. So the will, which is like the I am presence, and that aspect of it is part of the whole experience, but the way that feeds into it is a different aspect from the whole surface level cognition about it. And the point is, it's not just the first level of just simply experiencing things, and it's not merely conceptualizing about it initially, but it's re-representing abstractly and in a modest, intuitively fair out sense, the abstractions and the representation. It's redone. So it's recursive. It's not just a representation of reality, which is direct experience. It's not a re-representation of that. It's a re-representation of that and a representation of that and so forth. So it can go, there's no really a limit, or there might be, but there may not be really a limit to how much that can happen. So essentially, and then what we discussed here is quantum physics. So we were discussing how, for example, if there's a tube and there's a light in the middle of this tube and two people on either side, one person on either side, that basically one person will get a photon on the other one side, the other person will get a photon on the other. But due to quantum entanglement, each person is intertwined with that light due to the photons, which are waves in the field at the same time anyway, being entangled with the source and potentially entangled with each other by being entangled with the source, which is, and there's also the aspect of quantum physics where it's kind of transcends space and time, which are illusions anyway. So yeah, and this is the whole spooky action at a distance thing. And if you consider stars, each star is a light source. Each observer, no matter where in the universe they are, of photons from that light is quantum entangled with that star and each other. Just from that. So that's a very significant aspect of the interconnectedness and the unity between things. So that's a lot, and that unity is largely something I touched on as well. And I also very much explored I delved into the quantum, the Henry Stapp's theory about a realistic understanding of it's basically taking the Copenhagen interpretation as an actual description of reality, not merely a set of rules to do mathematics on for quantum physics. And that fundamentally leads us to something pantheistic or panpsychism, which is actually something that's similar to what he was talking about. And actually Spinoza, who I'm actually going to do readings on soon, which is going to be pretty interesting. And also the law of one. And well, mysticism in general is often like that. So I know you want me to get to it, but I thought that I would just summarize certain things about what we've been dealing with so far. What we've been dealing with last is that there's been an attempt basically to get a theory of everything, but while retaining materialism. And this has effectively led to this whole situation, which is very much like when they were trying to measure, they were trying to make sense of the solar system with the Earth being in the middle and everything moving around it, even the sun. And they're looking at the movement of these stellar objects, like the sun and stuff, based on that assumption, and it wasn't really making sense. It was getting extremely more and more complicated. Basically mental backflips, but with more, scientific, but pretending it's science, right? And that's basically what has been happening with these ramifications of quantum physics for the last 100 years. Seriously, I guess you could say demolishing, to put it dramatically, the Newtonian materialism, the physicalism that's the main paradigm for the last over 100 years, right? And yet it's been that aspect of it is brushed on the rug, and they're all trying to kind of maintain that in various ways. And so, but this universality that quantum physics more than hints at, pretty much proves, yeah, the case for that is pretty solid. And I've been exploring that in, not just in this, but also the readings I've been doing above Henry P. Stapp's book about quantum physics, which is very interesting. But I recommend it if you haven't heard it, but it is probably some of the more heavier stuff I've done so far. Anyway, I know that's like, what, 10 minutes or something, just giving you a summary, but I think it might help. And if not, well, you can tell me that. If you think it went on too long, comment in if you're on YouTube and tell me. So there we go. We're at chapter 11, an overarching conceptual framework. So, but what does man possess that God does not have? Because of his littleness, puniness, and defenselessness against the Almighty, he possesses a somewhat keener consciousness based on self-reflection. He must, in order to survive, always be mindful of his impotence. God has no need of this circumspection, for however he come up against an insuperable obstacle that would force him to hesitate and hence make him reflect on himself. Carl Jung in Answer to Job in 1952. Figure 3, which I'll show you here if you're watching on YouTube. Let me see what I'm showing you here. Take it in and pause it or something. Yeah, so figure 3 summarizes the preceding discussions. The only ontological primitive in Schopenhauer's metaphysics is the universal will depicted in the figure by an all-encompassing circle. And generally, an all-encompassing circle, it's represented by the snake eating its tail, generally. The circle represents kind of the monad of all that is. And it's Ouroboros. So generally, the Ouroboros, the snake eating its tail, is, yeah, a circle, everything that, all that is basically, yeah. The unification of all. That is one, but still a unity of many. So within the wall, alters depicted by smaller circles form as a consequence of disassociative processes. Yeah, I forgot to mention that. The last reading, what we were dealing with is the idea that it's a bit like someone in disassociation, suppose they had psychosis or something. And that's what everything in reality is like. And it's all fractured up into infinitesimal small pieces, right? Or to many pieces. And it's kind of like that. And that's the idea that Bernardo Kastrup was talking about. There was a reason for this. And if you want exactly the reasons, I would listen to the previous episode. And if you haven't listened to the previous episode, I would recommend all the readings of this book, but it's up to you. So it's a bit like this, it's a bit like, I compared it very much to the law of one, which is this idea of, for every density, which is 7 in reality, well, I say that, but this idea of correspondence as well, but this idea that there's infinitely small pieces and infinitely big pieces to reality. And it's fractal. Reality is fractal. That's the idea. And fractured and alters are basically like when people have split personality disorder or dissociative personality disorder. And it's basically about the idea that each soul is an alter of God. And they have flesh suits that are bodies, basically. Though not necessarily, they might have a stone suit instead, but it's the burst density. To put it in law of one terms. But anyway, where were we? Within the wall, alters depicted by smaller circles form as a consequence of dissociative processes. Now keep in mind, these are mini Ouroboroses, which are the whole of everything, despite being within the whole of everything. So this reminds me of Ken Wilber's idea of, I'm glad I remember his name this time, of holons, which are parts of a whole, which are the whole as well. And this also linked to the law of correspondence, where you get the same patterns because as above, so below, as below, so above. Why would the parts not be wholes in themselves? And since also there's this idea of if every point in space and time is connected fundamentally, to say adjacent is fundamentally one, then no particular subsection, any particular subsection is also the whole at the same time, if that makes sense to you. Right. So each alter has its own internal experiential state encompassed by its respective dissociative boundary. So this would be fractured consciousness or conscious awareness, so that each would have its own perspective, which would be not rather than the whole, it would be, well, it would be part of the picture, but them together would represent the whole perspective. And it sounds like I'm contradicting myself when I said that in a sense each part is also the whole. That's because it's a paradox, and it kind of transcends basic logic. I know that sounds like a cop-out, but you're just going to take it or leave it, really. So the experiential states of the will that are not encompassed by any alter are referred to in the picture as the will at large. Okay, so the outside is the will. The will at large, experiential states in superposition, no individual entity, space-time, or causality. So the area that isn't a particular alter, but everything in between is the will at large. But I wonder, so if the will is all that is, that circle around it all, but everything filling in the gap between this, to say, alters, these little circles within it, is the will at large. Now, maybe the holographic reality is also an extension of the will, which is all that is. So I guess it's kind of like, I don't know, in a very loose sense, it's like the spirit flesh of all that is. I'm not sure if that metaphor works, but yeah, it's the at large part of the will as a whole. But you can also focus in on particular parts, particular alters of within the overall will. So all alters are surrounded by the experiential states of the will at large, which, as we've seen in chapter 9, exist in a quantum superposition outside space-time. So all of them are different possibilities existing at the same time, or different positions. They're all true at the same time until observation occurs, in which there's a collapse into one of them being, they're infinite by the way, but one of them being what it is, or at least for that observer. But of course, these overlap with other observers, and that's the nature of co-creation, where different beings manifesting create with each other the reality as a whole. Like actors in a play, it's not just one actor, it's the play is the whole thing created by the actors interacting. Also, as Schopenhauer insists, the notions of individuality and causality do not apply to the will at large, which is, by the way, the universe at large, perhaps. It consists instead of a unitary, indivisible, quantum mechanically entangled whole. Perception results from the interaction between internal experiential states of the alter and external, superposed experiential states of the will at large. This, in fact, can explain quantum observation and the so-called collapse of the wave function, as I've elaborated upon in Kastrup 2017a. So, so perception comes from the interaction between experiential states of different alters, let's say, in this terminology, of different souls, different observers. And also with the experiential states of the will at large, all that is. And from all this together interacting, you get the co-creation of reality. You get what is manifesting in the universe, in holographic universe. It may be, universe it still is. And this is, well, what I was talking about with co-creation. So more specifically, an external experiential state impinges on an internal one. Much like, e.g., repressed, effectively disassociated emotions can surreptitiously impinge on our thoughts and produce new experiential distals, as a result, thereby creating a new experiential state, the immediate feeling of sense impression. Interesting. Now, in this diagram, so the plant alters have, they have the alter, which is the middle, ALTER, by the way, not the thing you do rituals on. The white bit in the middle, which is the plant or the alter itself, and the perceptual representations around it, just in the form of stimuli. So just as a plant will react to where the sun's coming and will move to do that. Or even if it's trying to get, if a plant is a Venus fly, one of the ones that snaps closed when there's a stimuli created from a fly and then eats it. It's very simplistic. It's like a precursor of the precursor to consciousness as we know it as humans. The precursor being animal, or whether there's the animal alter and there's the perceptual re-representations of the animal, but where there's not the level of re-representation where it's sapience, but there might be something what you might call sentience, in the sense that a dog will have. And you know, dogs and cats and and animals in general, they have more than what plants have. There's more than mere reaction to stimuli, but there's not that self-awareness in the sense that humans have it. And this may well link to the density system as well in the law of one. Plants, actually no, because the plants, it's the like different levels of the second density, the plants and animals. As for what first density like objects have, like stones, let's not get into that at this point. I have actually addressed that kind of in a previous episode on this book. So the next one is humans, where we have the middle circle, which is the center, which is the white, the alter itself. Then we have the abstract representations of absolute represent. Okay, then we have from the outside, perceptual re-representations, then within that, abstract re-representations, and then within that, abstract re-representations of abstract representations, re-representations. So it's that recursive thing that we discussed about, these layers of an onion, kind of. So, and this is more how it's portrayed by, well, how Schopenhauer's metaphysics are portrayed by Bernardo Kastrup. I do partly agree with this, but it's not necessarily exactly what I'm saying per se, although this does kind of make sense and it fits within pantheism. So, to repeat a little bit, effectively, disassociated emotions can surreptitiously impinge on our thoughts and produce new experiential gestalts as a result, thereby creating new experiential state, the immediate feeling of sense impression. The latter, once processed by the intellect, becomes a perceptual representation. The mutually pointing arrows at the dissociative boundary of each alter in Figure 3 depicts this interaction between internal and external experiential states. Which I've explained. So it's basically how the will around everything. Then in the space between different, say, alters in this case, different observers, let's say, there's the will at large. And this is the holographic universe which observation and manifestation and creation molds, basically. It's holographic and it's molded in that sense. In that sense of simulation. But the input of, let's say, information or experience or what have you, comes in different forms. It comes as basic stimuli for a plant, perceptual re-representations in animals, and then it comes in perceptual representations, abstract re-representations, and abstract re-representations of abstract re-representations in the human case. Or at least according to this diagram. The dark gray space between the arrows corresponds thus to perceptual re-representations. Clearly, the contents of perception are always relative to the individual subject. Now, keep in mind, the observation of each alter manifests the will at large, and that will at large in turn is perceived and abstracted and re-represented by alters or observers. Equivalent but simpler interactions between internal and external experiential states also give rise, in the case of plants, to stimulus apprehension. Indeed, Schopenhauer grants this equivalence between perception in animals and stimulus apprehension in plants. What susceptibility to light, in consequence of which it guides its growth in the direction of the light, is to the plant is the same in kind as knowledge, i.e. perceptual representation, to the animal, in fact, even to man. In further of human alters, perceptual representations can be further re-represented in the form of abstract re-representations, which in turn can ground further levels of abstract re-representations. This corresponds to the higher levels of human metaconsciousness, depicted in Figure 3 by the concentric lighted grey circles in human alters. The white inner core of the alters, circumscribed by the respective layers of re-representations or stimuli, depicts the alter's own endogenous experiential states, i.e. the endogenous feelings shown in Figure 1. okay, well, what is figure 1 just for reference? I might need to find it, and that might take time. And you'd only be able to see it. I'll just carry on. The physical world consists, according to Schopenhauer, of perceptual re-representations in the intellect of an observing individual subject. Therefore, as shown in figure 3, and in compliance with relational quantum mechanics, Ravelli, 1996, and I would say also probably in relation to, what was it, realistically construed orthodox quantum mechanics that Henry Stapp talks about, and I've been dealing with in my quantum mechanics readings so far. Okay. In compliance with the relational quantum mechanics, each author has its own physical world as part of itself. Yet these different physical worlds can be similar to and consistent with one another, just as multiple cars of the same make and model can be practically indistinguishable from one another. For all authors are immersed in the same will at large, and as such inhabit the same experiential environment. Solipsism is therefore thereby avoided. And this fits into, I would say, generally speaking, the perspective, let's say, the representation, perhaps, of, well, Hermeticism, the law of one, mysticism generally, and panpsychism, pantheism. As I've been talking about so far. The physical world of an author is an objectification of experiential states of the will at large that surround, in a cognitive rather than a spatial sense, the author. But because in addition to the inanimate universe, we also perceive other living organisms around us, some of these surrounding states must somehow indirectly correspond to other authors. This is possible because as author A interacts through mutual impingement of experiential states across the respective dissociative boundary with the will at large, some of the states of the latter accrue information about author A. Then, when another author B interacts with the will at large, some of that accrued information about author A becomes reflected in experiential states constituting the physical world of author B. I would say also that many timelines which are just like tiny bit different, and they're all interweaving and diverging and coming together, and that is also part of the picture. Author A then becomes indirectly represented in the physical world perceived by author B. In the language of re-representation, i.e. of objects in space-time causally interacting with one another, we can say the exact same thing as follows. An organism B perceives another organism A because A leaves an imprint in the world it shares with B in the form of released photons, air vibrations, drifting scent molecules, etc. Also keep in mind that if everything is non-locally connected with so-called spooky extended distance and there's quantum entanglement with everything pretty much, so to speak. But he says this is a non-local connection between everything and interaction with everything on some level. And there's a universality to all things. So if that's the case, it's not just what we're doing discussed, what I just read out there is true, but not in a separate, so not a separated sense. It's much more of an interconnected sense. I mean, it's all part of the overall whole, even according to that diagram. The will and the will at large. What is the form of an author's perceptual re-representation? As we've seen in chapter 10, it is a living body, a notion that can be restated in a variety of different but equivalent ways. The internal experiential the internal experiential states of an author are presented on the screen of perception of another or even the same author as a living body. The internal experiential states of an alter are objectified in the physical world of another, or even the same alter as a living organism. C, a living body is what the internal experiential states of an alter look like from across the alter's disassociative boundary. Oh dear, the cat's outside. Well, nothing I can do. The cat being another living body with its own perception, of course. So all this applies to me and the cat. That might help. And maybe that cat, if I don't hear the cat, is it there? Or is it only there when I hear it? It's like the Schrodinger's cat, but it's my cat. Or was my cat, but I can't hear it anymore. So, okay, I hope my cat's still there. Right. So, indeed, Schopenhauer explicitly links each alter to a living body. The subject of knowledge appears as individual only through his identity with the body. Life is thus the physical appearance or objectification of dissociative processes in the will. It follows that death, i.e. the end of life, must be the physical appearance of the end of this disassociation, i.e. the reintegration of an alter into the will at large. And indeed, Schopenhauer says that death does away with the illusion that separates an individual subject's consciousness from that of the rest. So, in a sense, we unify with source, in a sense, when we die. But according to the law of one, it's not as simple as that. But there is a sense in which we're more connected to the unity of all things in between lives. And I would say that makes sense in terms of the law of one and similar ideas. Isn't it clear that for him, death represents the end of disassociation and life, therefore a form of disassociation? Schopenhauer's insistence that individual subjects correspond to organisms enclosed in a skin, i.e. in a boundary of some sort, can also be construed as implying a dissociative process, as shown in Figure 3. The experiential states of an alter are carved out from the will at large and enclosed in a dissociative boundary. Since the objectification of an alter is its respective physical body, there must be something in the physical body that corresponds to the dissociative boundary of the alter. Put differently, there must be something the dissociative boundary looks like when represented as part of the physical body. In our case, it is indeed our skin, but also our retinas, eardrums, taste buds, and mucous lining of the nose, our sense organs, are the objectification, the perceptual re-representation of the dissociative interface through which our alter interacts with the will at large. Although I would add that intuition is also an interface, perhaps a more reliable one if you really get a hang of it. And there might be more as well, like extrasensory or ESP capabilities, but let's not get into that at this point. It's very much dealing with this idea that we're in flesh suits and we're as eternal souls, living temporary existences. The conceptual framework proposed in Figure 3 makes explicit that sense impressions and therefore perceptual re-representations only arise in the will as a consequence of disassociation. It is the formation of a dissociative boundary that allows for the non-associative impingement of experiential states beyond the boundary on experiential states within the boundary. This impingement, which constitutes sense impressions, is analogous to how, e.g., a repressed emotion can impinge on a thought without having evoked the thought through an associative link. Our sense organs, the very vehicles of perception, are merely the extrinsic appearance of this disassociative boundary. They would not exist without the disassociation, and thus neither would perception. So there's more to this boundary and this disassociation than merely having a body. It may well be linked to the veil of ignorance that we voluntarily have as we go into incarnation. But I suspect there's more to it than that. Our sense organs, the very vehicles of perception, are merely the extrinsic appearance of this disassociative boundary. They would not exist without disassociation, and thus neither would perception. Perception is this limited kind of illusory experience that's mediated through this disassociation and this disconnect, not being truly connected to source. Now, what happens if while being discrete parts, this boundary dissolves? Discrete parts with, let's say, a dotted line boundary around the edge, where the alter becomes aware of its own position fully with an open heart. And I'm talking about awakening into 5D or fourth density. If this barrier, at least on a conscious level, that yes, so if you retain your body and you're being in a temporary life or incarnation, but attain consciousness of that, if the barrier in the consciousness ends, if the dissociative barrier in the consciousness ends between the alter and the will at large, then perhaps that is what awakening is into the next level of consciousness beyond what we're at, where there still is a boundary, but the knowledge that the boundary is just representation, and that basically the awareness of what's really going on is there. And there's a conscious, not just a subconscious, but a more conscious and direct interaction with the will at large and the will. And this is something where the law of one definitely goes into. But we're only going to truly find out, I guess, when we awaken, but this is an ongoing thing on Earth at the moment. You may well find out in your lifetime. So, yeah, we'll see how it goes. So, wait, where was I? Need to find where I was. Oh, okay. Oh dear. Okay. This is real professionalism here. Losing what page was on. Right. Okay. Can we trace this crucial conclusion back to Schopenhauer's own words? Surely we can. Knowledge, i.e. perceptual representation. Well, that's brackets. Okay. Knowledge and plurality or individuation stand and fall together, for they condition each other. And knowledge in this case is referred to as perceptual re-representations. Because otherwise, when I do this thing where I kind of read it out and the bit in brackets that's added in, I read it out as if it's part of the quote. And I've done that a whole bunch of times on this podcast. Sorry. Now, since the brain is an integral part of the body, it too is the objectification or physical representation of certain experiential states of the alter, namely those corresponding to what Schopenhauer calls the intellect and reason. This is why Schopenhauer speaks of both as functions of the brain. Brain anatomy and physiology are what the intellect and reason look like from across their disassociative boundary. The rest of the body is what the less metaconscious or not metaconscious experiential states of the alter look like from across the boundary. Schopenhauer is clear in this regard in many passages such as this. That in self-consciousness, and hence subjectively, is the intellect presents itself in the consciousness of other things, and hence objectively as the brain. And that which is in self-consciousness, and hence subjectively, is the will, presents itself in the consciousness of other things, and hence objectively as the entire organism. So this refers to I suppose, a unification of all things, or between different observers and beings. And also, there's this idea that the rest of the body, other than the brain, is a physical representation, let's say, of, well, reason, I suppose you could say. And it also seems to remind me very much of the ego, whereas there's an aspect of not just awareness, which is the will aspect of us, that I am presence within. This seems to refer to this now, the I am presence in other people, so to speak, as far as people are real, as opposed to false boundaries. Did I just lose oils again? Oh, no, I didn't. Generally construes this correspondence between the intellect and the physical brain as Schopenhauer's espousing a particularly blunt form of materialism. This is rather baffling, as not only does Schopenhauer's argument entail or imply nothing of the kind, much to the contrary, as should be obvious by now, but Schopenhauer also downright ridicules materialism, more than once considering it, e.g., reason for a sudden fit of the inextinguishable laughter of the Olympians. Although there's something magical about laughter, isn't there? And, from what I hear, people on certain psychedelics have come back from it and been like, yeah, everything's a joke. And I don't know why everything's a big cosmic joke. I can't remember, but I know it is. That sort of thing. So laughing at reality and being aware of the paradox of things and all that, it's kind of like keep out of self-awareness, really. Anyway, indeed, insofar as materialism entails that experiential states are constituted or generated by particular arrangements of something outside and independent of consciousness, Schopenhauer is categorically not a materialist. The correspondence between intellect and physical brain that he talks about is one between essence and appearance, both of which are experiential. The conceptual framework proposed in Figure 3 brings out the relationship between individual subjects and their surroundings. Got that wrong. And their surrounding environment. The conceptual framework proposed in Figure 3 brings out the relationship between individual subjects and their surrounding environment, left implicit in Schopenhauer's metaphysics. It also clarifies how the process of perception in and of itself arises and unfolds within the unitary will. It certainly does clarify things. Most importantly, the proposed framework anticipates modern attempts to circumvent both the hard problem of consciousness, Chalmers 2003, that afflicts physicalism and the subject combination problem. that afflicts constitutive panpsychism. Chalmers 2016. So the subject combination problem, okay, that affects the pardon me, I kind of said that wrong. Maybe I just don't need to say the references. Maybe that's better. Most importantly, the proposed framework anticipates modern attempts to circumvent both the hard problem of consciousness that afflicts physicalism and the subject combination problem that afflicts constitutive panpsychism by positing that universal consciousness, the will, is nature's sole ontological primitive and that it is fundamentally unitary, unified, everything being one. The framework avoids both A, the need to reduce consciousness to some other ontological category, say, it's all just thought, it's all just attention, say, and B, the need to explain how fundamentally separate subjective points of view combine. As in, they're all unified, so there's no need to explain it because it's already explained, I guess. While circumventing these arguably insoluble problems, the framework still accommodates and makes sense of canonically empirical facts that would otherwise be at least difficult to reduce to universal consciousness. These facts are: A, we all seem to be separate beings inhabiting the same world. B, we can't change this world simply by wishing it to be different. Well, we can, actually. I think, even on the basis of Schopenhauer's, even on the basis of Bernardo Kastrup's representation of the metaphysics, I think B is false, because I would say, well, unless of course you're false to me. I mean, obviously, if people truly believe that they can't change the world, then it's true for them until they believe they can, and then it's true. They're creating that limitation, and that limitation is true as long as they make it true, in one sense. Although, that said, if you're unconscious of it, you're still moved around like a ping pong ball. Like in reality, like the law of attraction still applies even if you're not aware of it. The mirror effect, it applies. Like things happen in your life that affect you based on your subconscious without you being aware of it. And if you're aware of it, then that's better, but it still happens. So, and with regard to that diagram, it's that interaction between where we get input from the will at large. So where we mold the will at large with our conscious observation, with observation and our manifestation and such. We also experience stuff based on how others do that, and others experience the universe based on how we do that. And we co-create together. And that itself, I mean, that's changing the world by wishing it to be different on some level. Though that said, it doesn't require wishing it to be different. It can be done without wishing it to be different as well. But certainly, the law of attraction can be consciously done. That's not necessarily, although I don't recommend doing it in a selfish way, like, oh, I want this much money, I'm just going to wish it to happen. Like, but ultimately, it's your call. But I don't think it's that simple. If you don't do the inner work, I mean, you're not going to get what you're going to attract might be negative. But anyway, C, our inner experiential states correlate with measurable brain activity. Yeah, that's true. The framework proposed in Figure 3 reduces all these facts without postulating any ontological category different from consciousness. A, we are all disassociative alters immersed in a will at large, which explains why we seem to be individuals who inhabit the same world. B, we can't change the will at large merely by wishing it to be different because we are disassociated from it. And C, measurable brain activity correlates with our inner experiential states because the former is what the latter look like from across the dissociative boundary. Interesting. And brain activity is frequency and vibration, and that's really what everything is. So maybe it would look that way from the outside, because maybe that's what it is. And there was something else. What was it? Maybe the extent to which we can affect the will at large by wishing it correlates to the extent to which correlates. What's the opposite of correlates? Maybe there's a negative correlation between how disassociated one is and how much they can affect reality by wishing it, so to say, how much they can manifest. Let's put it another way. So essentially that we can manifest more and more effectively when we're more consciously aware of our unification with all things, and we open our heart as well, where we're more directly connected with source, and our consciousness has got the frequency where we are more consciously connected. And that frequency is fundamentally linked with unconditional love and an open heart chakra. And opening a heart chakra is fundamentally what awakening is about. So it's kind of like the extent to which we can affect reality by wishing it aligns with our awareness, our extent of awareness, our frequency. And that's a way I can modify what they're saying here. But there's definitely stuff that makes sense in what Bernardo Kastrup is saying here. By explicating these facts coherently, a much more detailed and rigorous elaboration of which I have provided elsewhere, the framework allows us to reduce the whole of empirical reality to the unitary will, just as Schopenhauer intended, and also in line with things like the law of one. I acknowledge that this conceptual framework, unlike most of what has been discussed in previous chapters, is not explicit in Schopenhauer's argument. As such, it is both an interpretation and a further elaboration of Schopenhauer's thoughts. Nonetheless, I submit that it compellingly unlocks and reveals the overarching sense and coherence of Schopenhauer's metaphysical ideas. In other words, it brings Schopenhauer's claims together in an eternally consistent and satisfying manner that, short of a rather fanciful fluke, cannot but reflect Schopenhauer's underlying implicit thinking. When one reads the world as will and representation under the light of this framework, it becomes difficult to imagine that Schopenhauer could have had anything substantially different in mind. So that's chapter 11. And will I do chapter 12? It depends on how long it is. Because this has been about, actually, I don't know how long it's been. But, I'll tell you what, I will end this episode now. As for if I continue immediately afterwards with a new episode, I'm not sure. But yeah, it's I think it's been leading up to this for a while in this text. And well, this is of course an overarching conceptual framework. So of course it's bringing together everything from so far into representation of reality. And I think it's pretty elegant. And I think that Bernardo Kastrup, well, as Schopenhauer was, I would say, and how many mystics and others have ascertained, it's kind of coming to the sense of the unity of all things and what our interaction with reality is. It's quite a neat framework, I think. I like it, but I mean, obviously it fits within a way of thinking and viewing things that I already have. So I admit that I have a bias there. So yeah, I've enjoyed this and I'll leave it at that for now. So without further ado, bye for now.